Imagine you're at a party and someone mentions a meme that went viral last week. Everyone laughs. Everyone except one person who just smiles politely and says, "Oh, I'm not really on social media." And suddenly the room does this strange thing where it shifts slightly, like a collective double take. People look at them the way you look at someone who just said they don't own a microwave. How do you live? We've built a world where being online is so assumed, so baked into the daily routine that opting out of it feels almost radical, maybe even suspicious. And here's where it gets psychologically interesting, because the people who don't use social media aren't broken, antisocial, or living in a cabin off the grid. Many of them are in fact some of the most intentional, self-aware people you'll ever meet. So today, let's get inside their heads. Let's talk about the real psychology of people who don't use social media, what drives that choice, what it does to the brain, and what it quietly says about the rest of us. First, let's address the assumption most of us carry without even realizing it. We tend to think of social media abstinence as a deficit, like something is missing in a person's life. Maybe they're shy or technophobic or can't handle the social dynamics. But psychology tells a completely different story. Research from the University of Bath found that when participants quit Facebook for a single week, their well-being, life satisfaction, and sense of emotional calm all improved significantly. 1 week, that's it. The brain, it turns out, experiences social media much like it experiences a slot machine, a variable reward loop where you pull the handle, scroll the feed, and sometimes you get a like, sometimes nothing, sometimes a comment that stings. Your brain releases dopamine in anticipation, not just reward. That's why you check your phone before you even consciously decide to do it. People who step away from that loop aren't missing out. They're stepping off a ride that was never really designed for their well-being. Now here's something worth sitting with. The people who don't use social media didn't necessarily leave because they couldn't handle it. Many of them left, or never started, because they understood something about themselves that most of us are still figuring out. Psychologists call this metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking, to notice patterns in your behavior and make deliberate choices about them. When someone says, "I got off Instagram because I realized I was comparing my life to strangers and feeling worse every single day," that's not weakness. That's one of the most sophisticated acts of self-awareness a person can perform.
There's a personality dimension researchers point to here, and it's called autonomy, one of 3 core human needs identified in self-determination theory by Dietschy and Ryan. People with high autonomy need to feel like they're genuinely authoring their own life, not performing it for an audience. And social media, structurally, is a performance platform. Every post is a presentation. Every caption is crafted. People high in autonomy often find this subtly exhausting or even existentially uncomfortable. Not because they're antisocial, but because there's something in them that resists the curated self. They'd rather be than be seen. Think about the people you've met who seem genuinely unbothered, who carry a kind of calm in social settings that's almost magnetic. Sometimes those are the people who aren't tracking their online image 24 hours a day. There's a cognitive load that comes with managing a public persona, even a small one. Every post carries a silent question. How will this land? What does this say about me? How many people cared? When you remove that loop from your life, your mental bandwidth opens up in ways that are genuinely hard to describe until you've felt it. People who've never been on social media never developed that split-screen consciousness in the first place, the one where you're living your life and simultaneously narrating it for an invisible audience. And then there's the social comparison piece, which might be the deepest rabbit hole of all. Leon Festinger, back in 1954, proposed that humans have a fundamental drive to evaluate themselves by comparing themselves to others. It's wired in. Social media didn't create that urge, it supercharged it. It took something that used to happen occasionally in organic social settings and turned it into a 24/7 fire hose. Every scroll is a fresh round of comparison. Their vacation, their body, their relationship, their success, their seemingly effortless Tuesday.
People who opt out of this aren't naive about human nature. Often, they've simply made a clear-eyed decision that they don't need an algorithmic stream of curated highlight reels to form their sense of self. They're measuring themselves against their own values, not against a feed. Here's where it gets a little philosophical, and I think it's worth going there. There's a concept in psychology called the looking glass self, introduced by sociologist Charles Cooley, which says that our sense of who we are is shaped significantly by how we imagine others see us. Social media is essentially a looking glass on steroids. You don't just imagine how others see you, you get quantified feedback in real time. Likes, comments, shares, follower counts. Your identity gets numerically ranked. People who step away from that are, in a sense, reclaiming their identity from the metric system. They're saying, my worth doesn't live in a number. And psychologically, that is a remarkably healthy place to stand. But let's not romanticize this completely, because psychology is always more complicated than a tidy narrative. Some people who avoid social media do so from anxiety, a genuine fear of judgment, of visibility, of digital conflict. That's different from intentional abstinence, and it matters. If the absence is driven by avoidance rather than autonomy, it can actually reinforce isolation rather than protect well-being. The distinction is everything. Are you choosing real life or hiding from something? Because one of those paths leads to peace, and the other just relocates the discomfort. A good therapist or honest journal can usually tell you which one you're doing. For the majority, though, the people who simply don't see social media as a necessary feature of a good life, the research consistently shows something counterintuitive. They tend to report stronger real-world relationships, higher levels of present-moment awareness, and a clearer sense of what they actually value. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology showed that limiting social media use to 30 minutes a day led to significant reductions in loneliness and depression. 30 minutes. We're not talking about full abstinence, just less. Imagine what full abstinence does to someone predisposed to introspection. There's also something happening in their attention that's worth naming. In a world where the average attention span is being carved up by notifications, autoplay, and infinite scroll, people who don't use social media often develop a kind of depth of focus that's becoming genuinely rare. They read longer, they sit with thoughts longer, they tolerate boredom, and boredom, psychologically speaking, is where some of the most creative and self-reflective thinking happens. Neuroscientist Mary Helen Immordino-Yang has shown that the brain's default mode network, the system that activates when we're doing nothing in particular, is actually essential for identity formation, moral reasoning, and empathy. We need to be bored. We need mental silence. And people who aren't constantly flooding that silence with content have more access to that deeper layer of themselves. So what does all of this say about us, the ones who are very much still on social media? I think it says something gentle, not judgmental. It says that we're all doing the best we can in an environment that wasn't built for human flourishing. It was built for engagement. Those are different things. The people who stepped back aren't superior. They're just further along in asking a question that all of us will eventually have to face. What kind of inner life do I actually want? And here's the thing. You don't have to quit everything tomorrow. But maybe the most valuable takeaway from the psychology of people who don't use social media is this. They made a conscious choice. They examined their habits. They noticed how certain platforms made them feel. And they decided deliberately that their attention was worth more. And your attention, it is also worth more. If this made you think about your own relationship with the scroll, the habit, the comparison, the quiet anxiety of the notification, drop it in the comments. I'd genuinely love to know. And if you want to keep going down this rabbit hole of how our minds actually work in the modern world, stick around. We're just getting started.